everybody. Today for you, podcast number 86. Today's podcast is titled The Audacity to Think You Can Grow. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of your weekly Limitless Life Network podcast. We are Dr. Pete and Sandy Lombardi, and this is the Limitless Life Network podcast where we flesh out the limitations that are preventing you from reaching your goals and living the life that you were called to lead. And today I think we have a really interesting podcast for you. But before we get started, we always have to start with some gratitude, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm very grateful for my wife. That she joins in on this podcast and she contributes in such a great way. And I know that we got some really great feedback this week from somebody who I respect a lot, he keeps telling me, Sandy is so good on the podcast. And he just recently, Dr. Chris Brown, recently learned that you can watch it on YouTube. And he just had such positive comments about my wife, Sandy. So,
well, thanks, Dr. Chris.
Yeah. And I got to say that Sandy, she doesn't, I don't know if she fully believes, but sometimes that's the humble and nature of my wife. And she's fantastic. So I know a lot of other people say the same. So, but we want to thank you all for taking time out of your day listening to this, because I know time is such a valuable commodity these days. People are always pressed for time. So thank you so much for listening. And also, thank you for sharing with other people, subscribing to the channel and so forth. All of that stuff is just great accolade, great confirmation, I guess, not accolade, confirmation that, we're speaking into your life and helping you out, and that's good. So I think today we brought together some good content, and so let's get started on with the show. Today's title, The Audacity to Think You Can Grow, it comes from two different places, right?
Right.
Comes from two different places.
Pete's been using the word audacity for 3 days because I was given a book with the title Audacity.
Yes, and I'm like, the audacity that you're reading in bed.
Keeping you up.
Yes, the audacity to read that book right now when I want to go to sleep. So, and also we went to dinner last week with a couple, Jack and Chelsea, and Jack's a great guy. He listens, he's a huge podcast listener of all different types of podcasts. And he's like, so what have you listened to lately? Mm-hmm. And I listen to podcasts too, but I don't think as much as him because he has a commute. And Jack was sharing with me that he was recently listening to Andrew Huberman's podcast. And I listened to that on occasion as well. So it made me go back and just kind of look and see what Dr. Huberman has been talking about lately. And I came across a podcast where he interviewed Dr. David Yeager, and it was about mastering the growth mindset and enhancing performance by mastering the growth mindset. And so if you get a chance, check that one out. I think it's really good. We're going to actually touch on a couple of points from that. And then Sandy's been reading this book, and I think they kind of both went together pretty well. Mm-hmm. So that's the backstory.
You covered it.
Covered it? Covered it. All right, so what's our first one?
First point is looking down and looking up.
Yeah, looking down and looking up. And this is straight from that podcast. And it talks about the mindset of we all have what happens when things don't go your way. And he used a great example of somebody that takes a test in school and they fail. They do miserably on the test. And the reaction is one of two things that's going to happen. That immediately our ego is hurt because, it doesn't look good to fail a test. So we can react by one of two ways. One, we can look down at the people that did worse than us and say, well, at least I'm not as dumb as that poor sap that got the 25. I got a 45, but at least I didn't get a 25. Mm-hmm. So I knew 45% of the material for this test. Or you can look up and say, okay, these other people in my class got a 95. What gives? I sat in the same class. Why did they get such a higher score? What did they do that I didn't do? And it's pretty obvious in that example which mindset is the one that's going to cause growth, and it's the mindset of somebody that's going to do well. So, any thoughts on that?
I know I can relate to the first where, you're in college and you'd say, oh, the professor's going to put a curve on that one because we all did, we like to group ourselves. And so I can relate to associating with the negative there. And I think we can also think of examples where we strive to emulate someone that's doing really well in an area that we are shooting for.
Yeah. I mean, whichever way you find yourself, in your past, say, it's part of our survival, believe it or not, to find a way that we fit in and to protect your ego to a certain regard so that you can carry on, right? So whether it's I'm fitting in and I'm not going to do much more work or do much different because it's in the past, it's already over with, we'll just move on to the next one and see if I do better. Or somebody that says, that's not acceptable, I'm going to buckle down and I'm going to really change my strategy and start to emulate what these people that were successful, what did they do?
I think of Dr. Tim in our office when you talk about that. He's such the personality that always strives for excellence and what can he do better and who can he learn from. He's just hungry for success and to follow success.
Yeah, well, that's the way he's built, right? He's kind of wired himself that way. And that brings us to point number 2, which is a point that he mentioned in passing kind of in this podcast, which is the brain gets smarter when it is pushed or challenged. And I think we've talked about this in a lot of different ways in the past and on the podcast, is that pushing or being challenged is something that, not everybody wants to do all the time, right? So we have, we will do what? We don't want to be challenged. We'll tend to shy away from something and seek comfort, seek ease, and avoid things that are difficult or a struggle for you. But, I know that's where greatness lies. It lies in the struggle. It lies in the overcoming of struggle and challenge and difficulty. That activates the creative side of your brain to solve problems. And that's something that I know that I enjoy doing, is solving and figuring out problems. And that creates some level of value when you can solve a problem. And there's a reward to that, right?
Right.
It always feels good when you fix something or make something that goes right that was going wrong, right? So yeah, the brain gets a reward, and the brain reward cascade when we solve problems, when we push through and we're challenged and we overcome. So, and that we develop a habit that way. Our brains develop and grow like a muscle in that exercise.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add to that?
Well, I'm just thinking of an individual close to me who tends to shy away from challenging situations, challenging environments, and I'm not sure where that came from or how it was created. But it never allows that individual to really grow into their potential. So I think for all of us, even if you have that tendency to recognize it and step into the challenges, because it is going to allow you to grow further than you can if you're constantly just avoiding those stressful situations.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, some people just want to play it safe, right? They're happy where they're at. So what happens then?
Right.
So then it's a mind. Then you're in a state of trying to hang on, and
nothing ever stays the same. So life will change. So if you're not willing to change and adjust, yeah.
Well, I mean that mindset of saying, well, I'm good where I am right now. Well, guess what? You're on your way down. Your bank account dwindles. Your relationships, they fall apart. Without investing in them. People die in your life. People that you're friends with, you lose friends. Like the less you go out there and promote and are actively pursuing and challenging yourself and putting yourself out there, when you stop doing that, that's when you stop living, and that's when your life begins to go into chaos and starts to fall apart.
And that status quo kind of mentality attracts status quo. So it's not a thriving environment for that individual.
Right. Yeah. All right. So that brings us to another hot topic, and it's the topic of stress. And in this podcast, they talked about developing the stress stress is enhancing mindset. So think about that. Stress is enhancing mindset.
Very contrary to
Most people, when they hear the word stress or stressed, I'm stressed, are they thinking about it in a positive context, or are they thinking about it in a negative context? So any type of stress that we have, whether it's a physical stress like running a marathon or lifting some heavy objects or whatever, or it can be a mental stress where you've got a big deadline coming up or a presentation that you have to prepare for. All of those stresses require metabolic activity. They're going to put a demand on the body's resources one way or the other. Okay? The next thing that happens is that we actually make an appraisal of the stress. So we basically interpret it, and we develop a frame of mind around that type of stress. So we call it something. We label it. We label it good or we label it bad. We label it positive or we label it negative. And this is the greatest area where we have some level of control, or I think the greatest opportunity to spin it in a direction that is going to be beneficial, right? So an example would be, I've got a huge presentation to get ready for. I'm going to be presenting in front of all of the lawyers in my firm, right? Say I'm a lawyer, and I got this huge presentation to get ready for. So the night before, I am anxious. My blood pressure's high. I'm stressed, right? And so if I looked up on the internet what to do about when you're stressed, and I read through all the gibberish in there, it may say, oh, pour yourself a warm cup of tea and take a bubble bath and, read a book. Is that going to really be good for you to do when you have a presentation in the morning? No. I mean, you may have to pull an all-nighter to get this thing prepared to get it to where it needs to be. And so that level of heightened awareness, the increase of blood pressure, what's that doing? It's directing more blood and oxygen to your brain. That's what it's doing. It's making you more astute and acute to what you need to do. It's focusing you. It actually has a purpose. Stress has a purpose. It's a survivability mechanism to deal with a stress, whatever it may be, positive or negative, and then get through that.
In a short term.
Yeah, right. To survive that until the next one comes.
Right.
Right? And so then say you have the presentation, and the presentation bombs. Now you have a whole different type of stress, right? So now you have another stress imposed on you. All the partners in the firm think your presentation was horrible. It needs to be all redone. So now what? Now you can look at it as, oh my gosh, they're going to fire me. This is awful. Or you could frame it in a whole different light and say, isn't this amazing? I have all these wonderful partners that are giving me positive feedback. All the years of experience, I have such an opportunity to learn from this because I didn't know how to do it the right way. Now I'm going to learn how to do it the way that the masters do it, that the best people do it. I'm so lucky. But, it's how you appraise the situation.
Right.
Yeah.
And I imagine they're based on history. So if we can flip our perspective on it once, then we can gain on that, right? And it just becomes a forward
oh my goodness
change of our thought process.
It really does. And they talked about that in the podcast too, about how if you introduce an idea to somebody, like we're introducing this idea to you about developing the stresses enhancing mindset. So now say you've had experiences in the past, right? And you can think of where this has actually worked in the past for you. where you actually did this at one point. Okay, so that's some proof to you. And now if you go out there and you write about how you did that in the past, now you physically do that. Now you remember it. You've created a pathway that you've remembered it. And then going forward, what's going to happen is that you're going to start to think twice about stress a little differently. And this is the way that this doctor and his research, they were able to go in and talk to eighth graders, I believe, for 25 minutes, and they would do it one, maybe two times. Then they followed their success path after that, and it rose in just about every facet of their behavior going forward. How could you talk to eighth graders for maybe one or two 25-minute sessions? And this is how they did it with that 3-step process. They introduced a concept, they gave them a story that was relevant to them, and then they asked them to write about it in a way that it happened in their life previously. So those 3 things were versus, as a parent, I've told my kids, our kids, 1,000 different life lessons, and they remember maybe a couple, but, and who knows what they really carry with them. And I think other parents can relate to that. So, yeah. So you came up with point number 4, and I remember where this came from. So let's talk about point number 4.
Point number 4 is revisit what you already know, or instead of revisit, you could say renew. So not thinking, oh, I've already got that area of my life, that topic, that subject matter down, don't need to go back there. Actually, our pastor spoke on this, but revisiting it and renew that belief system or those truths in your life. Don't just consider it done. And I think either way, like if it's an area you've had victory, how powerful for you to go back and revisit that if you need confidence in a new area you're stepping into. So there's a lot of ways you could take that.
I love this concept. Revisit what you already know. I have a saying in our office is that nobody really gets it. As soon as we start to assume that people understand what you're trying to teach them, then you stop teaching. And so now what? Now there's no growth at that point either. So revisiting it, and sometimes you feel like you're a broken record saying the same things over and over again. And even our podcast here, we've revisited and we've said a lot of the same messages, just packaged in different ways. And that's because you're different every time you hear it. And if you can hear something from a standpoint where 5 years down the road, you're a different human being, you've grown, you've changed. Now you're hearing it through a different set of ears and with a different mindset.
Yeah.
Now it has a different impact. It may have a bigger impact. It may have a more meaningful impact. So it's always, always good to go back and revisit what you already know.
Yeah.
I love, love, love that one. And then that brings us to point number 5, which actually comes out of this book that Sandy's been reading, and the point itself actually comes from a saying that I've heard for years from a doctor that was a mentor of mine who's no longer with us, but Dr. Sid Williams used to say, nothing can stop a made-up mind. And
he was on fire, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah. But I'd like for you to, share in the book a little about this book, about the history of this woman and her life. That'd be great.
Well, this book was about a young girl growing up in Russia and Jewish family and fled persecution there and came to America and had to work to support her family and ended up in a clothing sweatshop in New York City in early 1900s, 1905 to 1908. And the work conditions were horrible. But even before she arrived there were a lot of cultural things that she fell into. Like she, as a girl in that culture, was not allowed to read books, to have an education. And she knew how important that was to her. And so she always had in her mind that she would learn, and she would learn to speak English. And she read all great Russian theologians, and she would sneak books and get her hands on. And she just never stopped with this dream, if you would, or belief that something greater could come and she didn't have to just suffer as the generations had in her family. And so when she came to America, she saw there was hope for change here. And she actually began unions for women and men in these work conditions in New York City and made a big change. And so it's a powerful story of really believing that you can be the instrument of change. So it's a thought process. Like she just completely was sold out that it was possible, even when her family kept telling her it wasn't.
Yeah. I mean, she, the word that came to mind to me when you were talking about that was the word pursuit. Like she was in a relentless pursuit for something.
Mm-hmm.
And the name of the book is what?
Audacity.
Yeah, it's Audacity. And you looked up,
It
before the podcast, we looked up Audacity just to get a definition of Audacity. I mean, we've all heard that word before, but I think we should drill into that a little bit.
Yeah, I wrote it down so I wouldn't. Intrepid boldness, like that. And then bold or arrogant disregard of normal restraints. And I said to Pete, okay, we could do a whole podcast on that. What's, quote, normal restraints?
Yeah. Those are cultural norms, right? That's how traditional norms, how we've always done it, right? You can't go against that, right? And that's what in her family, the men of her family didn't work. You were saying, but they were scholars,
right?
So they studied all day long, right? And so that's all they did is they studied, and the women had to go out and work. And here she was not working and striking, right? She'd go out on picket to try to get rights, and her mother would beg her to just go to the sweatshop and work. Because they needed the food, they needed the money, right? Just to survive.
Right.
So, what are you pursuing? I guess is the question. What are you relentlessly pursuing in the, I guess, the face of normality, or what our culture thinks is normal? Intrepid boldness. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. So, a lot to think about, a lot to unpack here. If you get an opportunity, check out those that podcast or that book. It's available on Spotify. I know the book. I'm sure you can buy it on Amazon.
I'm thinking too this week when you think of I'm stressed, like just think of us and smile and joke that yes, I'm stressed. I'm going to grow.
It's an opportunity.
Right.
It's an opportunity. All right. Well, that's all we have for this week's edition of your weekly Limitless Life Network podcast. Be sure to join us next week. Tune in as in each and every week so you can stay connected, be inspired, and keep moving toward your best life by stripping away your limitations. And we will see you next week.